I never thought my fuel tank would become the subject of a neighborhood war. But here I was, standing in my driveway in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, staring at a certified letter from the Pine Grove Homeowners Association that threatened legal action if I didn't remove or disguise my propane tank within 30 days. My name is Brandon Walsh, and I had lived in this quiet suburban neighborhood for 3 years without incident. I worked as an HVAC technician, which meant I understood heating systems better than most people. Last October, I had installed a large residential propane tank on the side of my house because I was tired of skyrocketing natural gas prices and wanted to switch my heating system over. The tank was perfectly legal, met all county codes, and was positioned exactly where the city inspector had approved it. I had all the permits, all the paperwork, everything done by the book. But apparently, Karen Zimmerman, the HOA president, had other ideas. I read through the letter again, my coffee getting cold in my other hand. The document was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. My fuel tank was an eyesore that violated the community aesthetic standards, and I needed to hide it from view or face fines of $200 per day. The letter cited some vague clause about maintaining property values and visual harmony within the community. I pulled out my HOA covenant documents that night and read through every single page. Nowhere in the original agreements from when the neighborhood was developed in 2008 did it mention anything about fuel tanks. I checked the addendums, the amendments, everything. The only thing I found was a general statement about maintaining properties in a manner consistent with neighborhood standards, which was so vague it could mean anything. The next morning, I called the HOA management company. A bored-sounding woman named Jessica answered and transferred me to Karen's voicemail. I left a polite message explaining that I had all the proper permits and asking to discuss the matter. 3 days passed with no response. On Thursday evening, I was coming home from work when I saw Karen standing in my driveway with another woman I recognized as Deborah Pierce, the HOA secretary. Karen was in her late 40s, with that particular haircut that somehow became universal among a certain demographic, and she was wearing expensive athleisure wear despite the February cold. She was taking pictures of my propane tank with her phone. "Can I help you ladies?" I asked, parking my truck and stepping out. Karen barely looked at me. "Just documenting violations for our records. You received our letter." I did, and I left you a message. "That tank is completely legal. I have permits from the city." "City permits don't override HOA covenants, Brandon." She said my name like it tasted bad. "This is a planned community with standards. Show me exactly where in the covenants it says I can't have a propane tank." Deborah, who seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, pulled out a folder. Karen snatched it from her and flipped through pages. Section 12, Subsection 4. All external equipment must be screened from view of neighboring properties and public streets. That section is about trash cans and AC units. It says nothing about fuel tanks, and besides, I checked with the developer's office. That clause was never meant to apply to necessary heating equipment. Karen's face reddened. The HOA board has interpreted it to include all external equipment. You have 26 days left to comply, or the fines begin. We're trying to maintain property values here. Do you know what an ugly tank like that does to the neighborhood? It keeps my house warm and saves me money. And it's not ugly, it's just a white tank. It's industrial looking and completely inappropriate for a residential area. Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to that particular tone that people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while being completely unreasonable. "Look, Brandon, I'm trying to help you here. Just build a little fence around it or something. Is that so hard? A fence wouldn't hide it. The tank is 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter. I'd need an enclosure that costs thousands of dollars for something that doesn't need to be hidden. Then that's what you'll need to do. Karen smiled tightly. 26 days. She and Deborah walked away, leaving me standing in my driveway fuming. I went inside and immediately started researching Iowa HOA laws. What I found was interesting. While HOAs had significant power, they couldn't enforce rules that conflicted with local building codes or safety regulations. More importantly, they couldn't retroactively enforce interpretations of vague rules without proper notice and a formal hearing. I drafted a response letter citing the relevant Iowa code sections and requested a formal hearing with the HOA board. I sent it certified mail the next day. I also joined a Facebook group called HOA Horror Stories, where I posted my situation. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared similar stories, and several lawyers in the group messaged me offering advice. One attorney in Des Moines named Robert Chen told me that my case was solid and that the HOA was clearly overreaching. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later in the community center. I spent those weeks gathering documentation. My original HOA covenant, all permits, photos showing my tank was no more visible than several other pieces of equipment in the neighborhood, and printouts of Iowa law regarding HOA powers and limitations. The night of the hearing, I arrived early. The community center was one of those generic suburban buildings with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. The HOA board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Karen in the center, Deborah to her right, Treasurer Michael Patterson to her left, and 2 at-large members I barely knew named Susan and Frank. About 15 neighbors showed up, which surprised me. I assumed they were there to support Karen, but I recognized a few friendly faces. Karen called the meeting to order with a gavel that seemed unnecessarily theatrical. After some preliminary business about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance, she got to my item on the agenda. Mr. Walsh, you've requested a hearing regarding our notice about your propane tank. You have 10 minutes to state your case. I stood up, my folder of documents in hand. Thank you. I'm here because the violation notice I received is based on a misinterpretation of our covenants and potentially violates Iowa state law. I have all the required city permits for my propane tank. It was professionally installed and meets all safety codes. The section of the covenants you cited specifically mentions trash receptacles and air conditioning units, not fuel storage necessary for home heating. Karen interrupted. The language says all external equipment, which has historically been interpreted to mean temporary or movable equipment, not permanent fuel systems. If your interpretation is correct, then you'd also need to require screening for electrical meters, water meters, gas meters, and electrical junction boxes, none of which are screened in this neighborhood. Michael, the treasurer, leaned forward. He has a point, Karen. I'm not finished, I continued. Iowa Code Section 528A explicitly states that HOAs cannot enforce restrictions that conflict with local building and safety codes. My tank was approved by the city specifically for that location due to safety clearances. Forcing me to enclose it could actually violate fire safety regulations because propane tanks require proper ventilation. I handed out copies of my research to each board member. Susan, one of the at-large members, actually read through the documents carefully. Furthermore, I said, even if you believe your interpretation is correct, Iowa HOA law requires proper notice before enforcing new interpretations of existing rules. You can't suddenly decide a rule means something different without amending the covenants through the proper procedure, which requires a vote of the membership. Karen's jaw tightened. This isn't a new interpretation. This is enforcement of existing rules that you're violating. Then why didn't you notify me during the permit process? I filed for my permits 8 months ago. The tank has been installed for 5 months. If this was such a clear violation, why wait until now? That got murmurs from the audience. One of my neighbors, Tom, called out, "Yeah, I've had my tank for 2 years and never heard anything about it." Karen banged her gavel. "This isn't a town hall. Mr. Walsh, the board will deliberate and provide our decision in writing within 5 business days. I'd also like to note for the record that I'm prepared to file a complaint with the Iowa Attorney General's office if this enforcement action continues, as it appears to be arbitrary and potentially discriminatory." That was probably a bit much, but I was angry. The meeting concluded, and as people filed out, several neighbors came up to me. "I can't believe Karen's doing this," Tom said. He was in his 60s, retired, and had one of the better-maintained yards in the neighborhood. "I've got a propane tank behind my garage. It's green, but it's still visible from the street." "She's on a power trip," another neighbor, Rachel, added. "Last month she tried to fine me because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black. I had to literally bring her paint swatches to prove it matched the approved color list." Over the next few days, I heard nothing from the HOA. On the 5th business day, right at 5 p.m., I received an email. The board had voted 3-2 to uphold the violation notice. I had 20 days remaining to comply or face daily fines. The email was brief and gave no explanation for rejecting my arguments. I forwarded the email to Robert Chen, the attorney from Des Moines. He called me that evening. "This is cut and dry," he said. "They're clearly in the wrong, but fighting this legally could cost you thousands and take months. Do you have the funds for that?" "Not really. I just paid for the tank and the heating system conversion. I'm pretty much tapped out." "Then I'd recommend malicious compliance. Give them exactly what they asked for in a way they can't complain about but won't like." "What do you mean?" "They said hide the tank. They didn't specify how. Get creative." That conversation planted a seed. I spent the weekend thinking about what I could do. Building an enclosure was expensive and potentially unsafe. Painting it wouldn't hide it. Landscaping wouldn't work in the Iowa winter. And then, on Sunday afternoon, while I was watching my neighbor's kids build a snowman, it hit me. I could disguise the tank as a giant snowman. The idea was absurd enough to be perfect. Karen wanted the tank hidden. Fine, I'd hide it in plain sight. Iowa winters meant snow, and a decorative snowman would be completely normal. More importantly, the HOA covenants had an entire section about holiday and seasonal decorations being explicitly allowed and even encouraged. I spent Monday researching and planning. The propane tank was white, cylindrical, and about 8 feet tall, perfect snowman base material. I needed to create a structure around it that looked like a snowman without interfering with the tank's function or safety features. Tuesday after work, I stopped at the hardware store and bought supplies: chicken wire, white fabric, polyester batting, weather-resistant craft foam, and various materials for decorating. I also bought a couple bags of quick-set concrete for the base. Wednesday evening, I started construction. The bottom of the tank was the tricky part. I built a circular base around it using lumber and chicken wire, then stuffed it with batting to create a rounded bottom section. I made sure to leave all the proper clearances around the actual tank and kept everything away from the valves and connections. My neighbor Tom came over while I was working. "What on earth are you building?" "A snowman. Karen wants the tank hidden. The covenants say seasonal decorations are allowed, so I'm making a decorative snowman." Tom started laughing so hard he had to sit down on my driveway. "Oh my God, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant." Word spread quickly. By Thursday evening, I had a small crowd of neighbors watching me work. Rachel brought me coffee. Another neighbor, Phil, who was a carpenter, actually helped me build the frame. The project became a neighborhood event. The tank itself formed the middle section of the snowman. I wrapped it carefully with white weather-resistant fabric, making sure not to compromise any safety features. The top was trickier because I needed to build an entire head section above the tank. I used more chicken wire and batting to create a large sphere, mounting it on a frame that connected to my house's wall, not the tank itself, so the weight wasn't on the fuel system. For the face, I used large foam circles painted black for eyes and buttons. I made a carrot nose from orange foam. I found an old top hat at a thrift store and secured it to the top. For arms, I used actual tree branches that Phil helped me install at the right height. By Saturday afternoon, my giant snowman was complete. It stood about 12 feet tall, and it was magnificent. The propane tank was completely invisible inside. From the street, it just looked like an elaborate, oversized lawn decoration. Several neighbors took photos with it. Kids from down the street asked if they could pose for pictures in front of it. I added a few finishing touches. A red scarf made from fabric, some decorative coal buttons, and LED lights that made the snowman glow at night. I named him Frosty, because of course I did. Sunday morning, I was inside drinking coffee when I heard a car door slam hard enough to rattle my windows. I looked out to see Karen marching across my lawn toward the snowman, her phone out, taking pictures from every angle. Deborah was with her, looking nervous. I went outside. "Morning, Karen. What do you think?" She spun around, her face purple with rage. "What is this?" "It's a decorative snowman. You demanded I hide my fuel tank. It's hidden. This is ridiculous. This is a mockery. This is compliance with your order. The tank isn't visible anymore. Problem solved. You can't just put up a giant snowman in February. It's absurd." Section 18 of the Covenants explicitly allows seasonal and holiday decorations. There's no size limit specified, and there's no end date for winter decorations. Winter doesn't officially end until March 20th. Deborah was trying not to smile. Karen noticed and glared at her. "This is not what we meant, and you know it." "Then perhaps you should have been more specific in your violation notice. You said to hide the tank. The tank is hidden. If you have a problem with my seasonal decoration, you can take it up with the board, but I should remind you that the covenants specifically state that seasonal decorations are at the homeowner's discretion. I am the board president. Then I guess you have a conflict of interest." I'm sure the other board members would love to hear about this at the next meeting. Karen took several more pictures, then stomped back to her car. Deborah lingered for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I think it's creative, and I voted against the violation notice." That surprised me. "You did?" Susan voted against it too. It was 3-2. Michael, Frank, and Karen pushed it through. She glanced back at Karen's car. "I should go, but good luck." The next week was quiet. My snowman became a minor neighborhood celebrity. People driving by would slow down to take pictures. A local news station even reached out asking if they could do a story about it, but I declined, not wanting to escalate things further. Then I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was a violation notice for oversized seasonal decoration and installation of structure without architectural approval. The fine was $500, due immediately, with additional daily fines of $100 if the Snowman wasn't removed within 7 days. I called Robert Chen again. Can they do this? Read me the exact covenant language about decorations. I pulled out my documents. Section 18, subsection A. Homeowners are permitted to display seasonal and holiday decorations appropriate to the time of year. No prior approval required. Does it specify size limits? No. Duration limits? No. Then they can't fine you for this. And as for architectural approval, decorations are specifically exempted. They're reaching. They're angry you outmaneuvered them and they're trying to intimidate you. So what do I do? Write a response citing the relevant sections and refusing to pay the fine. Demand another hearing. And document everything. If they try to place a lien on your property over this, we can fight it easily. I did exactly that. I also started recording every interaction with the HOA. I invested in a doorbell camera and a couple of security cameras covering my property, just in case. The second hearing was scheduled for mid-March. In the meantime, winter was ending, which presented a new problem. I couldn't claim the Snowman was seasonal if it was up in April and May. I needed a new strategy. That's when I had my second brilliant idea. I would change the decorations with the seasons. The structure would stay, but I'd redecorate it for spring, summer, and fall. The framework I'd built was weather-resistant and sturdy. With some modifications and different decorations, I could turn my Snowman into a series of seasonal sculptures. The second hearing had a much bigger crowd. Apparently, word had spread on social media. Someone had posted about my situation in a local Facebook group, and it had gone viral in the Cedar Rapids area. Several news outlets were there, which surprised me. Karen looked furious when she saw the cameras. She called the meeting to order, and we went through the same routine. When it came to my item, Karen barely let me speak. Mr. Walsh has erected an oversized decoration without approval in clear violation of our architectural standards. Section 18 explicitly allows seasonal decorations without approval, I countered. There's no size limit specified. I've checked with 3 different attorneys, and they all agree that my decoration complies with the covenants. Michael, the treasurer, spoke up. I've reviewed the covenants myself, and I have to agree with Mr. Walsh. We don't have grounds to fine him for this. It's a ridiculous eyesore, Karen snapped. That's subjective, Susan said. Actually, I think it's kind of charming. My kids love it. This is about property values and maintaining standards, Karen insisted. One of the news reporters raised her hand. Can I ask a question? Karen's face went rigid. This is a closed board meeting. Iowa open meetings law requires HOA board meetings to be open to all members and guests unless you're discussing legal matters or personnel issues, the reporter said. I'm Andrea Mills from KCRG. Mrs. Zimmerman, are there other decorations in the neighborhood that exceed typical sizes? I noticed several homes with elaborate Christmas displays that were up past February 1st. That's different, Karen said. How is it different? This is not a press conference. Karen banged her gavel. The board will deliberate and issue a decision. But Frank, one of the at-large members who had voted with Karen before, surprised everyone. Actually, I'd like to motion that we table this matter pending a full review of our decoration policies. It's become clear that we don't have consistent standards, and trying to enforce vague rules is just going to lead to more conflicts. I second that, Michael said immediately. Karen looked like she wanted to explode. That's not necessary. We can vote on this now. I've made a motion and it's been seconded, Frank said. We need to vote on the motion. The vote was 4-1 to table the matter. Only Karen voted against it. The fine was rescinded pending the policy review. After the meeting, Andrea Mills approached me. Would you be willing to do an interview? This is exactly the kind of story people love. HOA overreach is a hot topic. I don't want to antagonize the HOA more than necessary. You're standing up for your rights. That's newsworthy. I thought about it. Part of me just wanted this whole thing to go away, but another part was tired of being pushed around by Karen's power trip. Okay, but I want to be clear that I'm not against HOAs in general. I just think this particular situation has been handled poorly. The story aired 2 days later. Andrea did a great job presenting both sides, though Karen declined to be interviewed. The piece showed my Snowman, explained the propane tank situation, and discussed the broader issue of HOA rule enforcement. It included interviews with several of my neighbors who supported my approach. The response was overwhelming. The story got picked up by national news outlets. Suddenly, my giant snowman was famous. I started getting emails and messages from people around the country who had their own HOA horror stories. A lawyer from Chicago offered to represent me pro bono if the HOA continued their enforcement actions. A manufacturer of propane tanks reached out asking if they could use my story in their marketing materials. But the most significant response came from the Pine Grove Homeowners Association membership. Within a week of the story airing, a petition started circulating calling for a special election to recall Karen as board president. The petition needed 30% of the membership to sign it to trigger a recall vote. It reached that threshold in 4 days. Karen didn't go quietly. She sent out a lengthy email to all residents claiming that I was bringing negative attention to the neighborhood and harming property values. She accused me of staging a media circus and being uncooperative. She said the recall effort was orchestrated by people who wanted to see the neighborhood decline into chaos. It backfired spectacularly. The email was so over the top that it actually motivated more people to support the recall. Even people who had been neutral or uninterested in HOA politics signed the petition after reading Karen's rant. The recall election was held in April. In the meantime, spring had arrived, and I needed to make good on my seasonal decoration concept. I spent a weekend transforming my snowman into a spring garden sculpture. I replaced the black foam eyes with colorful flower decorations. The carrot nose became a cluster of tulips. I covered the white fabric with colorful butterflies and added hanging baskets of flowers around the base. The top hat became a planter with trailing ivy. My 12-foot fuel tank was now a 12-foot spring celebration. The neighborhood kids loved it. Parents brought their children by to take Easter photos in front of it. It became a thing. The recall election results were decisive. Karen was removed as president with 72% voting in favor of recall. Deborah was elected as the new president, with Susan becoming vice president. Michael remained as treasurer. Deborah's first act as president was to call a meeting to revise the decoration policies. The new policy established clear, reasonable guidelines. Seasonal decorations were allowed year-round as long as they were appropriately themed and maintained. Size restrictions were removed entirely. The policy also clarified that fuel tanks and necessary utility equipment were not subject to screening requirements as long as they met local code requirements. More importantly, the board passed a resolution requiring that all future rule interpretations be clearly communicated to all members before enforcement actions could begin. They also established an appeals process that included neutral mediation before fines could be assessed. I attended that meeting and spoke in favor of the new policies. I shook hands with Deborah afterward. "Thank you for being reasonable," I said. "Thank you for standing up to Karen," she replied. She needed to go. She's been on a power trip for 2 years, and the rest of us were too intimidated to push back. You gave us the courage to make a change. Karen wasn't at the meeting, but I saw her a few weeks later at the grocery store. She glared at me from across the produce section, but didn't approach. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband were thinking about moving to a different community. As spring turned to summer, I updated my fuel tank sculpture again. This time, I turned it into a patriotic display with red, white, and blue decorations for Memorial Day and the 4th of July. I added solar-powered lights that created a gentle glow at night. The neighborhood association actually asked if they could use my house in their community newsletter as an example of creative property enhancement. Tom, my neighbor with his own propane tank, asked if I could help him decorate his. We spent a weekend building him a smaller version themed as a lighthouse. Rachel decided to paint a mural on her fence. Other neighbors started adding their own creative touches to their properties. The neighborhood became more colorful and interesting. In August, I transformed the sculpture into a sunflower garden theme. In October, it became a harvest display with pumpkins and cornstalks. For the holidays, I went all out with a winter wonderland theme that brought the Snowman back but added lights, music, and animated elements. Kids from all over Cedar Rapids came to see it. Local businesses started reaching out. A garden center offered to sponsor my spring display. A lighting company wanted to provide LED lights for the winter display in exchange for a small sign crediting them. I declined the commercial sponsorships because I didn't want to turn my fuel tank into a billboard, but I appreciated the offers. The story continued to circulate online. I did a couple of podcast interviews talking about HOA issues and property rights. I even got invited to speak at a homeowners' rights conference in Chicago. The organizers paid for my travel and hotel, so I went. It was surreal standing in front of 200 people talking about my propane tank Snowman. But people seemed genuinely interested in the message about standing up to unreasonable HOA enforcement. By the time the first anniversary of the original violation notice came around, the situation had transformed completely. What started as a frustrating conflict had become a community unifying event. The new HOA board was working well. Property values had actually increased slightly, partly because the neighborhood had gotten positive attention from the news coverage. One Saturday in February, almost exactly a year after the Snowman first appeared, Deborah knocked on my door. She was with several other board members and neighbors. "We have something for you," she said, smiling. They presented me with a plaque that read, "Brandon Walsh, for creative problem solving and standing up for homeowner rights. Thank you for making Pine Grove a better community." I was genuinely touched. I don't know what to say. "You don't have to say anything," Susan added. "We should be thanking you. You could have just paid the fine or moved away. Instead, you fought back in the most creative, positive way possible. You changed this neighborhood for the better." Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "Plus, that Snowman is legitimately awesome." We all laughed. They'd brought beer and snacks, and we ended up having an impromptu party in my driveway. More neighbors showed up. Someone brought a speaker and music. Kids played in the yard. It was one of those perfect community moments that reminded me why I'd wanted to live in a neighborhood like this in the first place. As the party wound down and people headed home, I stood in my driveway looking at my fuel tank sculpture, currently themed as a winter cardinal perched on snow-covered branches. It was ridiculous. It was excessive. It was absolutely perfect. My phone buzzed with a message from Robert Chen, the attorney who'd given me advice early in the conflict. He'd seen my latest photos on social media. "Looks like it all worked out. Sometimes the best legal strategy is creative compliance. Glad you won, I typed back. Thanks for the help. Couldn't have done it without you. That night, I did some reflecting on the whole situation. A year ago, I'd been angry and frustrated, facing fines and legal threats over something that should have been simple. Karen had tried to use the HOA as a weapon to enforce her personal preferences under the guise of community standards. If I just paid the fine or built an expensive enclosure, she would have won. She would have continued bullying other neighbors. The HOA would have remained a source of anxiety rather than a positive community organization. Instead, by standing up for myself in a creative, non-confrontational way, I'd sparked a change that benefited everyone. The recall election would have happened eventually anyway, but my situation accelerated it and gave people a clear example of why new leadership was needed. Over the following months, the story of my fuel tank Snowman continued to ripple outward. I heard from people in Texas, Florida, California, and Pennsylvania who'd used my approach as inspiration for their own HOA battles. A woman in Phoenix painted her satellite dish to look like a giant sunflower. A man in Seattle built a decorative gazebo around his required backyard shed. Creative compliance became a thing in the HOA resistance community. I also learned that Karen had indeed moved. She and her husband bought a house in a rural area outside Cedar Rapids with no HOA. I heard this from Deborah, who'd been contacted by Karen's real estate agent about some final HOA paperwork. Apparently, Karen told the agent she was tired of dealing with difficult neighbors who didn't respect community standards. I felt a bit sorry for her. She'd probably genuinely believed she was helping the neighborhood, but she'd been so focused on control that she couldn't see how her approach was dividing the community rather than strengthening it. The new HOA board continued to make improvements. They renegotiated the management company contract and saved the association money. They organized community events that actually brought people together. They established clear, fair policies and enforced them consistently. Property values did increase, not because of strict aesthetic controls, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a neighborhood with a strong, positive community spirit. My fuel tank remained a landmark. People gave directions using it as a reference point. Turn left at the house with the giant seasonal decorations. Kids asked their parents if they could visit the Snowman house, even in July when it wasn't a snowman. It became part of the neighborhood's identity. In the second winter, I rebuilt the Snowman even bigger and better. I added animatronics that made the arms wave. I installed speakers that played winter music. I set up a donations box suggesting that visitors contribute to the local children's hospital, and we raised over $3,000 that season. The hospital sent a representative to accept the check, and local news covered it. The story came full circle from a conflict about property rights to a community charitable effort. As spring approached again, I started planning my next seasonal transformation. This time, I wanted to do something special to celebrate the positive changes in the neighborhood. I designed a tribute to community coming together, featuring handprints from neighborhood kids and messages about unity and cooperation. On the day I unveiled it, Deborah organized a neighborhood gathering. Over 100 people showed up. We had food, games, and a sense of genuine community that I'd never experienced before in any place I'd lived. Kids played together. Adults who'd never spoken before became friends. It was exactly what a neighborhood should be. During the gathering, Michael, the treasurer, pulled me aside. "I need to tell you something. When Karen first proposed the violation notice against your propane tank, I voted for it without really thinking about it. I trusted her judgment and didn't question it. "I'm sorry about that." "It worked out in the end," I said. "Maybe, but I should have done my due diligence. I should have read the covenants carefully and questioned whether we were being fair." I let Karen push through her personal agenda because it was easier than standing up to her. Standing up for yourself taught me to be a better board member. Frank, the other at-large member who'd initially voted with Karen, shared a similar sentiment. "I was new to the board and didn't want to make waves. I learned that staying silent when something's wrong is the same as supporting it. I won't make that mistake again." These conversations reinforced something I'd come to understand through this whole experience. Most people in HOAs aren't villains. They're just regular people trying to maintain their neighborhoods. But without proper checks and balances, even well-meaning organizations can become oppressive. It takes courage from individuals to stand up when things go wrong, but it also takes humility from leaders to admit mistakes and change course. The summer of that second year brought unexpected national attention again. A major home and garden network reached out asking if they could feature my seasonal fuel tank decorations in a show about creative landscaping and home exterior projects. They wanted to film a segment showing how I transformed the decorations through the seasons and discuss the backstory. I was hesitant at first, but after talking with my neighbors and the HOA board, I agreed. The show filmed over several months, capturing the transitions from spring to summer to fall. They interviewed neighbors, showed the community involvement, and told the story of how a conflict turned into a positive community transformation. The episode aired in November and got excellent ratings. The network told me it was one of their most watched segments. I started getting recognized occasionally when I was out in Cedar Rapids, which was strange but mostly positive. People would stop me to say they'd seen the show or read about the story online. Many shared their own HOA struggles and asked for advice. I always told them the same thing: know your rights, document everything, and look for creative solutions. And if possible, work to change bad leadership rather than just accepting it. HOAs are democratic organizations in theory, even if they don't always feel that way. Members have power if they choose to use it. Through all of this, my propane tank continued doing its actual job of providing fuel for my heating system. The whole conflict had started because I wanted to save money on heating costs, and that part worked out perfectly. My utility bills were significantly lower than when I'd used natural gas. The tank required minimal maintenance and provided reliable service through 2 Iowa winters. The irony wasn't lost on me that something purely functional had become a beloved community landmark and a national symbol of creative resistance to overreach. Sometimes, the best outcomes come from the most unexpected circumstances. As the second anniversary of the original violation notice approached, I reflected on everything that had changed. I'd lived in the Pine Grove neighborhood for 5 years now, and the last 2 had been dramatically different from the first 3. I knew my neighbors. I was involved in the community. I'd made real friends. The neighborhood felt like home in a way it never had before. Deborah and the new HOA board had proven that good leadership makes all the difference. They enforced necessary rules about maintenance and safety, but they did so fairly and with common sense. They encouraged creativity and individuality rather than demanding conformity. They saw the HOA as a service organization supporting homeowners rather than an authority ruling over them. Property values in Pine Grove had increased by an average of 8% over the 2 years since the recall election, according to a report Michael presented at the annual meeting. This was slightly higher than the Cedar Rapids average. Deborah made a point during that meeting of noting that the increases came not from strict aesthetic controls, but from genuine community desirability. "People want to live here because we're a real community," she said. "Not because every house looks identical, but because neighbors support each other and we've created something special together." The annual meeting also included a vote on a proposed amendment to the covenants. The amendment explicitly stated that utility equipment required by local code could not be restricted by the HOA, and it formalized the new decoration policies. It also established term limits for board members and required regular policy reviews to prevent stagnation. The amendment passed with 91% approval. After the meeting, I updated my fuel tank sculpture for the holiday season. This time, I created an elaborate winter village scene with the tank as the centerpiece. I added small decorative buildings, miniature trees, and an electric train that circled the base. Neighborhood kids could press a button to make the train run. It became a destination for families throughout Cedar Rapids during December. A toy store downtown asked if they could sponsor the display by providing toys for a charity drive. This time, I accepted. We collected over 500 toys for local families in need. The store got a small, tasteful sign crediting them, and everyone benefited. The charity angle had become an important part of what my fuel tank sculpture represented. It wasn't just about my property rights anymore. It was about bringing people together for positive purposes. On Christmas Eve, I was standing in my driveway watching families come by to see the display when Tom walked over with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Quite a journey from that first violation notice," he said, handing me a mug. "Yeah, I never imagined it would turn into all this." "You did something important, not just for yourself but for everyone. You showed that one person standing up can make a difference. The community made the difference. I just provided the spark. Don't sell yourself short. A lot of people would have just given up or moved away. You fought back in the smartest, most creative way possible." We stood there watching the kids play around the display, their laughter mixing with holiday music. It was cold, but I didn't mind. This was what community should feel like. January brought a new development. The city of Cedar Rapids reached out asking if I would serve on a task force examining HOA regulations and homeowner rights. Apparently, my case had highlighted some gaps in Iowa law regarding HOA enforcement procedures. The task force was charged with making recommendations to the city council about potential local ordinances to protect homeowners while still allowing HOAs to function effectively. I accepted the appointment. The task force included attorneys, HOA board members, homeowners, real estate professionals, and city officials. We met monthly to discuss issues and develop recommendations. It was fascinating to hear different perspectives and work toward balanced solutions. One of our key recommendations was requiring HOAs to provide detailed notice and explanation before imposing fines, with mandatory mediation before legal action. We also recommended that cities maintain a registry of HOA complaints to identify problematic associations that might need intervention. The Cedar Rapids City Council adopted most of our recommendations in March. The new ordinances wouldn't prevent all HOA conflicts, but they would provide better protections for homeowners and encourage fair enforcement practices. Several other Iowa cities reached out asking about our process and recommendations. The ripple effects from my fuel tank Snowman continued spreading. Through all of this, the decoration on my tank kept evolving. Spring brought a butterfly garden theme. Summer featured an underwater ocean scene with fish and sea creatures. Fall showcased a forest with woodland animals. Each transformation involved neighbors, especially kids who loved helping with the decorations. The seasonal changes became community events. I'd announce the upcoming theme on the neighborhood Facebook page, and volunteers would show up to help. It wasn't just my project anymore. It belonged to the neighborhood. Parents told me their kids looked forward to the seasonal changes as much as they looked forward to holidays. In May, 3 years after the original violation notice, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Karen Zimmerman. I almost didn't open it, assuming it would be angry or threatening, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was handwritten and surprisingly reflective. Karen apologized for how she'd handled the fuel tank situation. She acknowledged that she'd been on a power trip and had lost sight of what HOAs were supposed to be about. She explained that she'd been dealing with personal stress at the time and had channeled it inappropriately into controlling neighborhood issues. She said watching from a distance, as the neighborhood thrived under new leadership, had made her realize her mistakes. "I genuinely thought I was protecting property values," she wrote, "but I was really just imposing my personal preferences and calling it community standards. What you did with creative compliance was brilliant, but more importantly, you sparked positive change. I'm sorry for the stress I caused you. You were right and I was wrong." I was stunned. I never expected an apology from Karen, and I certainly didn't expect such a thoughtful, self-aware one. I wrote back thanking her for the letter and wishing her well. I didn't need to rehash the conflict or make her feel worse. The apology was enough. I showed the letter to Deborah, who was equally surprised. "That takes courage," she said. "Good for her for acknowledging it. The letter provided closure I hadn't realized I needed." I'd never harbored deep anger toward Karen, but there had been residual frustration. Knowing that she'd reflected on the situation and grown from it made the whole experience feel more complete. Life in the Pine Grove neighborhood continued peacefully. The HOA functioned as it should, addressing necessary maintenance and safety issues without overreaching into personal property rights. Community events brought people together regularly. New families moving into the neighborhood often mentioned that they'd chosen Pine Grove specifically because of its reputation for strong community spirit. My fuel tank sculpture remained a landmark and a reminder of what creative problem solving can accomplish. It also remained functional, reliably providing propane for my heating system. I'd calculated that over 3 years, I'd saved nearly $4,000 compared to what I would have spent on natural gas. The tank had paid for itself, and the decorations had cost less than building an enclosure would have. In August, I was contacted by a publisher asking if I'd be interested in writing a book about my experience. They wanted a practical guide to dealing with HOA conflicts, using my story as the framework. I thought about it carefully. Writing a book was a significant commitment, and I wasn't sure I had enough to say to fill an entire book. But as I outlined potential chapters, I realized I did have valuable information to share. Not just about my specific situation, but about HOA laws, homeowner rights, creative compliance strategies, community organizing, and how to create positive change in residential associations. I signed a book deal and spent the next several months writing. The book, titled The Snowman Solution, A Homeowner's Guide to Creative Compliance and HOA Reform, was published the following spring. It sold modestly but generated positive reviews. More importantly, I heard from readers who successfully used the strategies to resolve their own HOA conflicts. That feedback was more rewarding than any sales numbers. 4 years after the original violation notice, on a cold February afternoon, I was outside installing that year's winter decorations when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking nervous. "Are you Brandon Walsh?" the man asked. "I am." We're about to buy a house in an HOA neighborhood, and we're kind of freaked out about it after hearing horror stories. We saw your story and your book. Can we ask you some questions? We ended up talking for over an hour. I explained what to look for in HOA documents, red flags that indicate problematic associations, and strategies for protecting yourself while still being a good community member. They were grateful and relieved. As they left, the woman said, "Thank you so much. You've made us feel so much better about this." That interaction happened more times than I could count over the following months. I became an informal resource for people navigating HOA issues. I didn't charge for my time. It felt good to help people avoid the stress I'd experienced. The neighborhood continued thriving. Deborah served 2 terms as HOA president before stepping down and being replaced by Susan, who maintained the same positive, balanced approach. Tom joined the board. The culture of fair, reasonable governance became entrenched. My fuel tank sculpture evolved with the seasons, year after year. Each iteration brought new creativity and community involvement. Local schools started including it in art lessons as an example of functional art and creative problem-solving. The Children's Hospital made it an annual tradition to have their oncology patients visit during the holiday season when the display was most elaborate. 5 years after the conflict began, the original propane tank needed replacement. The tank had a typical lifespan of about 15 to 20 years, but a routine inspection revealed some where that meant it should be replaced sooner than expected for safety reasons. Part of me was sad to see the original tank go, but the replacement was actually an improvement. The new tank was slightly larger and more efficient. Installing the new tank gave me an opportunity to rebuild the decoration framework with improvements I'd learned over the years. The new structure was sturdier and easier to modify for seasonal changes. I also added more interactive elements, including sensors that triggered sounds and movements when people approached. The installation attracted attention, as everything related to my fuel tank seemed to do. Local news covered it as a feel-good follow-up story. 5 years later, the famous fuel tank Snowman gets an upgrade. The headline read. During the installation, several neighbors came by to help and share memories. Rachel talked about how the original controversy had inspired her to get more involved in community issues. Phil, the carpenter who'd helped build the first Snowman, brought his teenage daughter to help with the new one. Tom brought beer and sandwiches. "You know what's funny?" Tom said as we took a break. 5 years ago, I couldn't have told you the names of half the people on this street. Now I know everyone. This stupid fuel tank brought us all together. Not stupid, Rachel corrected. Historic, legendary. We all laughed, but she wasn't entirely wrong. My fuel tank had become a local legend. Tour companies in Cedar Rapids had started including it on their routes. The tourism board mentioned it in promotional materials. It was bizarre and wonderful. As winter set in, and I completed the seasonal decoration for that year, I reflected on how far everything had come. What started as a frustrating conflict with an overreaching HOA had transformed into something much larger and more meaningful. It had changed how I thought about community, about standing up for principles, and about turning negative situations into positive outcomes. The fuel tank continued its primary function of heating my home efficiently and economically, but it had become so much more than that. It was a symbol of creative resistance, a community gathering point, a charitable fundraising vehicle, and a reminder that with creativity and persistence, even the most frustrating conflicts can lead to positive change. The Pine Grove neighborhood had transformed too. From a place where an autocratic HOA president imposed arbitrary rules, It had become a genuine community where people looked out for each other and worked together. Property values had increased, but more importantly, quality of life had improved. People wanted to live there not because of strict rules, but because of genuine community connection. As I stood in my driveway on a cold evening, watching the LED lights make my latest winter creation glow against the dark sky, I felt grateful for the journey. I was grateful for Tom and Rachel and Phil and all my neighbors who'd supported me. I was grateful for Deborah and Susan and Michael for providing good HOA leadership. I was even grateful for Karen, in a way, because her overreach had catalyzed positive change that never would have happened otherwise. The giant fuel tank Snowman and its seasonal variations would continue to evolve and delight for as long as I lived in Pine Grove. It had become part of my identity and the neighborhood's identity. When people asked me about it, as they often did, I always told them the same thing. Sometimes the best way to fight unreasonable authority is not with anger or aggression, but with creativity and community. My fuel tank taught me that lesson, and it continued teaching it to everyone who saw it. And that, more than anything else, made the whole crazy journey worthwhile.